A black teen girl steps into a high-end jewelry store in Elmwood, bubbling with excitement as she searches for the perfect gift for her little sister. But that joy vanishes in an instant. The clerk's eyes lock onto her with baseless suspicion. One moment, one bracelet slipping from her fingers, and suspicion turns into outright accusation. Minutes later, cops storm in, slap cuffs on her, and take the clerk's word without question. But they have no idea what's coming next, because her father is about to walk in and turn everything upside down. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The afternoon sun bathed Elmwood, Massachusetts in a golden glow, turning the small town into something out of a postcard. In the park, children shrieked with laughter as they raced to the swings, parents chatted over iced coffee, and neighbors exchanged easy waves on their way to the weekend farmers market. But for Jamila Harris, today wasn't just another lazy Saturday. She had a mission: to find the perfect birthday gift for her little sister Kiana. For months, Jamila had been saving every dime she earned. She'd picked up extra shifts at Maple Brew Cafe, the local coffee shop where half the town got their morning fix, pouring lattes and scrubbing tables until her hands ached. Every tip, every paycheck, she tucked them away, all for this moment. She already knew what she wanted: a delicate silver charm bracelet from Harrington's Gems. She'd passed by the store countless times, her nose practically pressed to the glass, imagining Kiana's face lighting up. And today was the day. Jamila patted the wallet in her pocket, feeling the reassuring weight of her hard-earned cash. This wasn't just about buying a bracelet. It was about giving her sister something real, something she could hold on to in a world that hadn't always been kind to them. As she neared Harrington's Gems, the fanciest store in town, the sunlight bounced off its massive glass windows, reflecting her face back at her. She hesitated, adjusting her hoodie. It was unzipped, revealing the crisp blouse she had ironed that morning. She knew how people got when they saw a black girl in a hoodie. She'd seen the looks before, the silent questions, the assumptions. Shaking off the thought, she gripped the heavy glass door and pulled it open. A soft chime rang out, announcing her arrival. Inside, the store sparkled under bright white lights. Glass cases shimmered with rows of gold and silver, everything polished to perfection. The faint scent of expensive perfume and polished wood lingered in the air. A handful of customers browsed the displays, older women with pearl necklaces, men in tailored suits. Jamila caught a few quick glances her way, the kind that weren't exactly welcoming, but she ignored them. Her eyes locked onto the bracelet, still sitting on its velvet tray like it was waiting for her. Behind the counter stood Dorothy Ellis, a middle-aged white woman with sharp brown eyes and a gaze that could size someone up in a second. At first her expression was blank, just another bored day at work. But the moment she spotted Jamila, something shifted. Her mouth tightened, her fingers drummed against the counter, and her once lazy eyes zeroed in on her like a target. Jamila felt it immediately, that familiar tension, thick as smoke. She'd seen it before, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "What's a girl like you doing in a place like this?" Jamila had been through this before, the looks, the doubt, the quiet, unspoken judgment. But she wasn't about to let it stop her, not today. She stepped up to the counter, kept her voice steady, and pointed to the bracelet. "Hey, can I see that one, please?" Dorothy didn't move, she just crossed her arms. "You sure about that?" she asked, her tone dripping with something sour. "It's not cheap, you know." Jamila's stomach twisted, but she kept her face calm. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her wallet, and showed the thick stack of bills she had worked so hard to save. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I've got the cash right here." Dorothy's eyes flicked to the money, her lips curling slightly, like she had just caught a whiff of something rotten. But instead of easing up, her posture stiffened. Her hand hovered near the phone on the counter. "Ha," she muttered, letting out a dry little scoff. "And where'd a kid like you get all that money? Borrow it? Find it lying around somewhere?" Jamila froze. "Excuse me?" Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "That's a lot of cash for someone your age. What's the story? Did you earn it or what?" Jamila's jaw tightened. She inhaled slowly, keeping her voice measured. "I work at Maple Brew Cafe," she said. "I saved up for this." Dorothy didn't even try to hide her disbelief. Sure you did. She tapped her nails on the glass counter, shaking her head. You expect me to believe that? Jamila fought back the frustration bubbling inside her. Yeah, she said flatly, I do. Dorothy smirked. A dry, knowing chuckle slipped past her lips. Well, aren't you clever? She moved toward the case, but her suspicion hadn't faded. I've been here long enough to know when something's off, kid. I don't miss a trick. Jamila's hands balled into fists at her sides. She forced them open, breathing steady. Can I just see the bracelet, please? Dorothy let out a dramatic sigh, like Jamila was the biggest hassle of her day. Fine. She pulled the tray from the case and slapped it onto the counter. But be careful with it. That thing's worth more than you probably make in a year. Jamila bit her tongue. She reached for the bracelet, turning it over in her fingers, feeling the cool silver against her skin. It was perfect. Then, just as she adjusted her grip, it slipped. The bracelet hit the glass counter with a soft clink before bouncing to the floor. Before Jamila could even bend down to pick it up, Dorothy let out a sharp, exaggerated gasp. Oh my God, I knew it. Her voice cut through the store like a siren. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. Jamila's heart pounded. Wait! I knew you were up to no good, Dorothy's voice rose, shrill with false triumph. Thought you could swipe it and sneak out, huh? Not on my watch. Jamila's breath caught. What? No, Dorothy bolted for the phone, nearly knocking over a display of earrings. She punched in the numbers like she was calling in an armed robbery. Get the cops here now, she barked into the receiver. We've got a thief. Young black girl, hoodie, trying to rob us blind. Silence. Thick and suffocating. Jamila could feel the stares, the way a woman clutched her purse tighter, the way an old man in a blazer shook his head like he had seen this story 100 times before. The sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder. Too fast. Jamila's pulse slammed against her ribs. She'd known this could happen. She had heard the warnings from her father. Stay calm, don't argue, keep your hands visible. But knowing it and living it were two different things. She stood frozen, fingers twitching. Every part of her wanted to run, to yell, to fight back. But she knew better. One wrong move and this wouldn't just be about a bracelet. This could be about her life. The sirens grew louder until red and blue lights flashed against the store's pristine glass windows. The door burst open and 2 officers stormed inside. Sergeant Roy Mason led the way, older, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a hardened expression. Behind him was Officer Ethan Cole, younger, sharp-eyed, and watching everything closely. Dorothy wasted no time. There she is, she cried, jabbing a triumphant finger at Jamila. That's her, I caught her, red hand trying to pocket that bracelet. Jamila barely had a second to react before Mason's voice cut through the room. Hands where I can see 'em, miss. Her breath hitched, her fingers twitched at her sides. Every instinct screamed at her to defend herself, to explain, but she stayed still. One wrong move, one quick motion, and she knew exactly how this could end. Mason stepped closer, cuffs glinting in his hand. I said hands up. Now, I didn't do anything, Jamila said, her voice firm but controlled. Dorothy scoffed. Oh, please, are we really going to stand here and listen to this? She turned to the officers, eyes wide with mock outrage. I saw it. She dropped that bracelet. If I hadn't stopped her, she would have walked right out with it. Ethan hesitated, shifting on his feet. His gaze flicked to Jamila, then to Dorothy. Something in his face suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Mason, on the other hand, didn't seem to care. Step outside, kid. Jamila's chest tightened, the store felt smaller, the air heavier. She saw the story unfolding. Black teen caught stealing at luxury store. She knew how these things played out. But then she took a slow breath and did the only thing she could think of. Call my dad. Mason frowned. You'll get your call at the station. No, Jamila said, her voice stronger now. Call him. Right now. Dorothy rolled her eyes, letting out a dry laugh. Oh, sure, let her call Daddy. What's he gonna do, sue us? Make a scene? Please. Jamila ignored her. She reached into her pocket, slowly, carefully, and pulled out her phone. Her fingers dialed the number with practiced ease. "Dad," she said when the call connected, "I need you at Harrington's Gems. Now." Minutes later, the door swung open again. The atmosphere in the store shifted. A man stepped inside, his presence commanding without needing to raise his voice. He moved with the kind of confidence that made people take notice. He wore a crisp navy suit, his shoes polished, his expression unreadable. In his hand, he held up a badge. "I'm Malcolm Harris, Chief of Police for Elmwood PD," he said, his voice calm but firm. His sharp eyes settled first on Mason, then on Jamila. "And that," he nodded toward her, "is my daughter." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Mason's grip on his cuffs loosened. Ethan straightened. Dorothy went rigid, her face draining of color. "Sergeant," Malcolm continued, his voice dangerously smooth, "why exactly is my daughter standing here, being treated like a criminal?" Mason shifted, visibly thrown off. "Sir, we received a call about a theft." "And did you verify the claim?" Malcolm's voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it was impossible to ignore. "Or did you just walk in and decide she was guilty because of how she looks?" Mason's jaw clenched. Ethan looked like he wanted to disappear. Dorothy, however, found her voice. She dropped the bracelet. "I saw her." She folded her arms, though the confidence in her tone had started to waver. "It's obvious what she was trying to do?" Malcolm turned to Mason. "You checked the cameras yet?" Mason hesitated. "We were about to—" "No, you weren't," Malcolm interrupted, his tone razor sharp. "You were ready to cuff her without proof. That's not doing your job, Sergeant. That's racial profiling." Ethan cleared his throat. "Sir, I think we should check the cameras." Mason's nostrils flared, but there was no way out now. He gave a stiff nod. "Fine." Dorothy's face twisted. "What? You don't need cameras. You have me." You saw how she acted. Malcolm finally looked at her. And in that moment, whatever arrogance she had left crumbled. "Ms. Ellis," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you're looking at a customer who walked in with money she earned to buy a gift for her sister." He stepped closer, his gaze like a blade cutting through her. "A customer you judged before she even spoke." Dorothy swallowed hard. The footage played. It took less than 30 seconds to dismantle Dorothy's version of events. On the screen, Jamila walking in, polite, calm, asking to see the bracelet, showing her cash, the bracelet slipping, hitting the floor, Dorothy overreacting, clear as day. The silence afterward was loud. Ethan let out a breath, visibly relieved. Mason looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Dorothy stood frozen, lips slightly parted, grasping for an excuse that wouldn't come. Malcolm turned back to Mason. "So, Sergeant, you still want to arrest my daughter?" Mason didn't answer. Malcolm turned to Dorothy. "And you?" His voice sharpened. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Dorothy opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Didn't think so," Malcolm said coldly. He turned to Jamila, his voice softening. "Let's go, kiddo." Jamila didn't move right away. She stared at Dorothy, at Mason, at every person who had stood there and watched without speaking up. She wanted to feel satisfied, vindicated. Instead, she just felt tired. She shook her head, exhaling sharply. Then she met Dorothy's eyes one last time. "All I wanted was a bracelet," she said quietly. "Guess I got more than I bargained for." And with that, she walked out. Outside, the air was crisp, fresh. Jamila inhaled deeply, trying to shake off the weight of what had just happened. Malcolm walked beside her, hands in his pockets, quiet for a long moment. "You okay, kiddo?" Jamila let out a slow breath. "I should feel better, right? Like I proved something?" She kicked a pebble down the sidewalk. "But I don't." Her dad nodded. "You shouldn't have had to prove anything. That's the problem." She swallowed hard. "Yeah, I know." Just then, the store door creaked open again. Dorothy stepped outside, gripping her purse, looking small. She hesitated, like she wanted to say something, maybe an apology. But instead, she just walked away. Jamila snorted. "Figures." Her dad chuckled dryly. "They never own up to it." They reached the car. Malcolm pulled out his phone and made a call. "Vic," he said, I need a press release about Harrington's gems and Sergeant Mason. He glanced at Jamila. Oh, and make sure Dorothy Ellis's name is in there. She doesn't get to walk away clean. Jamila blinked. You're really going after them? Malcolm smirked. You think I'd let this slide? 3 days later, Harrington's gems was everywhere. And Jamila? She handed her sister the bracelet. And for today, that was enough. By Monday morning, Harrington's Gems was a different place. The once polished reputation of the store had been torn apart by the headlines. The story had spread fast, local news, social media, even national outlets picking it up. Black teen accused of theft, but her dad is the police chief. The store's Yelp page was flooded with one-star reviews. People called for boycotts. Some demanded Dorothy's firing. Others wanted answers from the Elmwood Police Department. And Dorothy? She had disappeared. Rumors flew. Some said she had been let go, others that she had taken an extended leave. Either way, her absence spoke louder than any statement. Sergeant Mason wasn't off the hook either. An internal review had been launched into his handling of the situation, and word was that Officer Cole had filed a report about the incident. For the first time in a long time, Jamila felt like maybe, just maybe, there were consequences for people like them. But it still didn't erase what had happened. The bell above the door jingled as Jamila stepped into Maple Brew Cafe. The smell of fresh espresso wrapped around her like a familiar hug. It should have been comforting, but the whispers started almost immediately. A couple of customers glanced at her and then quickly looked away. 2 girls from her school huddled at a corner table, sneaking looks in her direction. The guy behind the counter, Brandon, one of her co-workers, shifted uncomfortably. Jamila exhaled, gripping her apron as she made her way behind the counter. Yo, Brandon said hesitantly. You good? She shot him a look. Why wouldn't I be? Brandon rubbed the back of his neck. I mean, that whole thing at Harrington's. It's all over town. Yeah, I noticed. He hesitated. My mom said it was messed up what happened. She's not shopping there anymore. Jamila smirked. Guess that's something. Before Brandon could respond, the manager, Mr. Wells, appeared from the back. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and the calm presence of someone who had seen everything in life. Jamila! His voice was steady, but his expression was unreadable. She braced herself. Yeah? He nodded toward the office. Let's talk. Mr. Wells shut the office door behind them and gestured for her to sit. She stayed standing. He sighed, leaning against the desk. Look, I saw the news. I read the reports. I know what went down. Jamila folded her arms. Okay, he hesitated. And I also know how small towns work. Her stomach tightened. What's that supposed to mean? Mr. Wells exhaled through his nose. I've been in this business long enough to know that some customers, some might start looking at you differently now, not because you did anything wrong, but because, well, Jamila's jaw clenched. Because I didn't let someone treat me like trash. He held up a hand. I'm not saying it's right, I'm saying it's reality, and I want you to be prepared for it. She stared at him, trying to decide if this was a warning or a thinly veiled talk less, keep your head down conversation. So what? She said. You want me to quit? His brows furrowed. No, I want you to know I've got your back, but I also want you to be ready for whatever comes next. Jamila studied him, waiting for the catch. When none came, she nodded. Okay. He smiled slightly. Good, now get back to work. Her shift was almost over when the last person she expected walked in. Officer Ethan Cole. Jamila stiffened as he approached the counter. He wasn't in uniform, just a hoodie and jeans, but the sight of him still made her stomach coil. Brandon noticed too, stepping closer like he was ready to intervene. Ethan lifted a hand. I'm not here for trouble, just coffee. Brandon didn't move. Neither did Jamila. Ethan sighed. And to say I'm sorry, that caught her off guard. For what? She asked, crossing her arms. You weren't the one trying to cuff me. No, he admitted, but I didn't stop it either. He ran a hand over his jaw, looking uncomfortable. I knew something felt off, and I should have spoken up sooner. Jamila studied him. Why didn't you? His throat bobbed. Because sometimes it's easier to go along with the guy in charge than to call him out. Jamila raised an eyebrow. You are the guy in charge, or at least, you're supposed to be. He let out a dry laugh. Yeah, I guess I am. He exhaled. Look, I'm not asking for a pass. I just wanted you to know that I regret how I handled it. Jamila considered that. It wasn't a grand apology. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was more than Dorothy had ever given her. She nodded slowly. Okay. Ethan gave a small nod in return. Then he glanced at the menu. Now, about that coffee? Jamila smirked. Sure, but I'm charging you extra. That night, Jamila sat on the couch, flipping through her phone. The internet was still ablaze with conversations about Harrington's gems, but she was too drained to read them all. Kiana plopped down beside her, holding up her wrist. The silver bracelet shimmered under the lamplight. I still can't believe you got this for me, Kiana said, grinning. It's my favorite thing ever. Jamila smiled, but it was small. Yeah, Kiana tilted her head. But you don't seem happy. Jamila sighed. It's not fair, Ki. I did everything right. I saved up. I walked in there ready. She shook her head. And they still saw me as a criminal. Kiana was quiet for a moment. Then she gently turned Jamila's wrist, clasping something around it. Another bracelet. It wasn't fancy, just a braided thread with a small charm. But it was something Kiana had made herself. Jamila blinked. What's this? Kiana smiled softly. Something to remind you that no matter how the world sees you, I see you for who you really are. Jamila swallowed hard. She wrapped an arm around her sister, pulling her in close. Maybe today hadn't been a victory. Maybe tomorrow wouldn't be either. But she wasn't alone. That was enough for now. 3 weeks later, Harrington's Gems put up a sign. Under new management, Dorothy Ellis was gone. Sergeant Mason had been reassigned. And Jamila? She walked past the store one last time, glanced at the sign, and kept walking. She didn't need their bracelet anymore. She had something better. Life in Elmwood didn't pause after the scandal at Harrington's Gems. People had their opinions, some loudly supportive, others whispering behind closed doors, but Jamila didn't care anymore. She had spent enough time worrying about how people saw her. She just wanted to live. At school, some classmates treated her differently. A few avoided eye contact, embarrassed by their silence when the news broke. Others, like her best friend Maya, stood by her side without hesitation. You're basically famous now, Maya teased one day at lunch, scrolling through her phone. People online are calling you a hero. Jamila snorted. For what? Existing? For standing your ground, Maya corrected, for proving them wrong. Jamila shook her head. I shouldn't have had to prove anything. Maya sighed. I know, but you did, and that matters. Maybe it did. One afternoon, just after her shift at Maple Brew, Jamila was wiping down tables when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up and froze. Dorothy Ellis. Jamila's grip on the rag tightened as the woman hesitated at the entrance, her usual air of confidence missing. She looked smaller than before, like the weight of everything had finally settled on her shoulders. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Dorothy stepped forward. She wasn't dressed in her prim store attire, no pearl earrings, no stiff blazer, just a plain sweater and jeans. Jamila crossed her arms. You lost? Dorothy sighed, shifting awkwardly. No. Her voice was quieter than before. She swallowed hard. I wanted to say I was wrong. Jamila blinked. Out of all the things she expected, this wasn't one of them. Dorothy wrung her hands. I should have treated you better, I should have believed you, and I should have apologized sooner. Jamila studied her, searching for any trace of insincerity. She found none. Why now? Jamila asked, her voice even. Dorothy exhaled. Because I had time to think, and because, after everything, I lost my job. I lost my reputation. I thought about how quickly I judged you, how easily I assumed the worst. She hesitated, and I realized, if I had been in your shoes, if someone had treated me like that, I would have been furious. Jamila let the words settle. She didn't feel satisfaction, she didn't feel triumph. Just exhaustion. After a beat, she shrugged. Yeah? You would've. Dorothy nodded, looking down at her hands. I know it's not enough, but I am sorry. Jamila considered that. It wouldn't undo what had happened, it wouldn't erase the way she'd been humiliated. But Dorothy had shown up. She had said it out loud. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward something better. I hear you, Jamila said finally. Dorothy exhaled, like she had been holding her breath. She gave a small nod, then turned toward the door. Just before she left, she glanced back. Take care of yourself, Jamila. Then she was gone. Jamila let out a slow breath. Brandon walked over, raising an eyebrow. Did she just... Yeah, Jamila muttered. Brandon snorted. Took her long enough. Jamila shook her head, tossing the rag over her shoulder. No kidding. But as she turned back to the counter, something inside her felt lighter. Maybe not everything had changed, but some things had. And that was enough for today. A month later, Jamila found herself outside Elmwood High's auditorium. A student-led panel on racial bias was being held that evening, and the organizers had asked her to speak. At first she had laughed. Me? Speak? But then she thought about it. Thought about how many other kids had been in her position. Thought about how many of them had walked away with nothing but anger and silence. So she said yes. Now, standing in the hallway, her stomach twisted. She wasn't scared of speaking. She was scared that none of it would matter. She glanced down at her wrist. Kiana's bracelet shimmered under the lights, the tiny charm cool against her skin. She exhaled and stepped inside. The auditorium was filled with students, parents, teachers, even some officers from the police department. The moderator introduced her, and she took a deep breath before stepping up to the mic. She looked out over the crowd. She spotted her dad in the back, arms crossed, nodding in quiet encouragement. She saw Maya, Brandon, and Kiana all grinning at her like she was unstoppable. And she saw strangers, people who had followed her story, who were waiting to hear what she had to say. So she gave them the truth. She told them about that day, about the way she had been judged before she even opened her mouth, about the way people had looked at her, expected the worst, and about how she had stood her ground anyway. When she finished, the room was silent for a beat. Then, applause, some loud, some hesitant, but real. She stepped back, heart still racing, but lighter somehow. Afterward, people came up to her, some just nodded in quiet solidarity, others shook her hand. A girl from her school who had never spoken to her before whispered, "Thank you." Jamila just smiled, because for the first time in a long time she wasn't just reacting to the world around her. She was shaping it, and she wasn't done yet. That night, as Jamila sat on the hood of her dad's car outside their house, Kiana curled up beside her. "You were amazing," Kiana said, resting her head on Jamila's shoulder. Jamila chuckled. "You have to say that, you're my sister." Kiana nudged her. "No, seriously, you were." They sat in silence for a moment, the cool night air wrapping around them. Then Kiana whispered, "Are things going to get better?" Jamila stared up at the stars, thinking about it. Maybe things wouldn't change overnight. Maybe there would always be people like Dorothy Ellis and Sergeant Mason. But there would also be people like Ethan Cole, people who learned, people who listened. And there would be people like Jamila, people who refused to be silent. She squeezed Kiana's hand. "Yeah," she said softly, "they will." And for the first time, she truly believed it. Weeks passed, and life in Elmwood found its rhythm again. Harrington's Gems remained under new management, though Jamila hadn't bothered to step foot inside. Dorothy Ellis had faded into the background, no longer the self-important figure she once was. The town moved on, as towns often do, but Jamila knew that for her, things weren't quite the same. She wasn't the same. At school, she noticed how teachers were more careful with their words, how students who had once ignored her now acknowledged her presence, some with hesitant nods, others with cautious smiles. She knew what they were thinking. We saw what happened. We didn't do anything. And now, We don't know how to face you. She let them wrestle with that, but not everyone tiptoed around her. Maya remained the same, always talking too fast, always dragging Jamila into some ridiculous conversation about the latest TV drama. Brandon had her back more than ever, cracking jokes at work and making sure she never had to deal with customers alone when certain types walked in. And then there was Officer Ethan Cole. She saw him a few times around town, at the coffee shop, at the grocery store. He never pushed, never acted like they were suddenly friends, but when their paths crossed, he always met her gaze. That was something. One afternoon, Jamila's phone buzzed with an... She frowned, hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" A deep voice came through the line. "Ms. Harris?" She straightened. "Yes?" "This is Marcus Jennings. I run a youth outreach program in Boston. I read about what happened to you and saw the way you handled it." Jamila's heart pounded. "We do workshops on racial bias, leadership, and empowerment," he continued. "And I think you'd be a great speaker." Jamila's breath caught. "You don't have to answer now," he said, sensing her hesitation. "Just think about it. Your voice matters." She swallowed, gripping the phone. Okay. I'll think about it." "Good," he chuckled. "I have a feeling this won't be the last time someone asks you to speak." When the call ended, she just sat there, staring at her screen. Could she really do something like that? She thought about the panel at school, the way people had listened, the way her words had meant something. Maybe this wasn't the end of the story. Maybe it was the beginning. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Jamila found herself standing outside Harrington's Gems. She hadn't planned on coming here, hadn't even thought about it, but her feet had carried her to this spot anyway. The store looked the same, clean, pristine, expensive. But the people inside were different. The new manager, a middle-aged Latina woman, smiled warmly as she chatted with customers. The atmosphere felt lighter. Jamila took a slow breath and stepped inside. A sales associate greeted her. "Welcome. Let me know if you need help with anything." Just like that, no hesitation, no suspicion. Jamila nodded and walked over to the jewelry cases, her fingers brushing against the glass. She wasn't here to buy anything. She just needed to see it, to know that she could be here, that she belonged. She didn't stay long, just a few minutes. And then she walked out, head high, shoulders back. This time there was no one to stop her. As she walked home, the cool evening air wrapped around her. She thought about Kiana's question, "Are things going to get better?" She still didn't have all the answers. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't done pushing back. She wasn't done speaking up. And the world was going to have to listen. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more exciting stories every day. See you in the next one.